necessary and sufficient conditions, which are the last items there on that list for what the horseshoe is used to translate. So if we're looking at here, as I recommend, exercise set 6, back in section 1.2, there's a couple of examples there. So number 2, the problem number 2 says to fill in the blank so that we get a true statement. And the blank here is found in this sentence. Being an animal is a blank condition for being a tiger. So being an animal is a blank condition for being a tiger. Well, if we said that being an animal is a, for example, sufficient condition for being a tiger, then what we're really saying is that if we knew that there was an animal, that something was an animal, for example, then we would automatically know that it's a tiger, right? In other words, being an animal would be good enough to make something a tiger. And of course, that's not true. Being an animal is not a sufficient condition for being a tiger. So the correct way to fill in that blank is to say that being an animal is a necessary condition for being a tiger. Okay. Secondly, we see another one here. It's problem number 3, where it says drinking a glass of water is a blank condition for quenching one's thirst. So, drinking a glass of water, is it a necessary condition for quenching one's thirst? Well, that would mean that it's the only way you could quench your thirst is by drinking a glass of water. That's not true. However, drinking a glass of water is a sufficient condition for quenching one's thirst. In other words, if you were thirsty, you could drink a glass of water and your thirst could at that point be quenched. So that's how we would fill in the blank for that one correctly. Let's just look at one more here, a little bit of a controversy. In number 5, right? In number 5 it says, heating water is a blank condition for brewing coffee. Heating water is a blank condition for brewing coffee. Well, we certainly know that heating water is not sufficient for brewing coffee, right? It's not as if somebody wants coffee, they don't simply put a pot of water on the stove until it heats and then say, okay, where's my coffee? There are other steps involved to get coffee besides heating water. So it's not sufficient. The question is it necessary? And here I think that Patrick Hurley, the author of our text, is just missing something or behind the times, I don't know what. But you might know about the cold water brewing method for making coffee. I do. It's delicious. I recommend it. But heating water is not necessary for brewing coffee. That's the point of this. And so, in fact, I do think that that number 5 here is actually a bit of a mistake. Nonetheless, you will actually see this kind of exercise on the exam, so do the rest of these problems from 1.2, exercise set 6, because you'll see this on the exam. I'll give you blanks to fill in with either necessary or sufficient in order to make the statements true. But I'm going to ask you to go beyond that, because then I'm going to ask you to translate those statements into the symbols of propositional logic. And the way you can do this is by using this little formula, sun or S horseshoe N. And what that is simply telling us is that sufficient conditions are going to go on the left side of the horseshoe and necessary conditions go on the right side of a horseshoe. So to go back to these exercises we were just working with, leaving out the last one there, which was a bit of a problem. The first one that we looked at was being an animal is and we said, a necessary condition for being a tiger, right? And so we see that we're talking about a necessary condition. Necessary conditions, in this case, being an animal is a necessary condition. Necessary conditions go on the right side of a horseshoe. This tells us that being an animal is a necessary condition for being a tiger. In other words, if you're a tiger, you've got to be an animal. There's no two ways about that. Looking at the next one, right? Drinking a glass of water, we said, was a sufficient condition for quenching one's thirst. So now that sentence is talking about sufficient conditions, right? And this formula right here tells us that sufficient conditions go on the left side of a horseshoe. So what's the sufficient condition? Drinking a glass of water is a sufficient condition for quenching one's thirst. Drinking a glass of water is a sufficient condition for quenching one's thirst. So the point here is that anytime you have a statement that simply describes something as either a sufficient or a necessary condition, one or the other. You know you're going to have to use a horseshoe to express that. And then to figure out where each piece goes, whether it's on the left side or the right side of the horseshoe, you simply say, well, necessary conditions go on the right side of the horseshoe, sufficient conditions go on the left side of the horseshoe. So that's the little trick there. And again, get practice, work on those there in section 1.2. All right. Now, finally, of all of these operators, this will bring us to the triple bar when we're dealing with biconditionals. And so we'll look at this example. Tom is a bachelor if and only if he is unmarried and over 18. So, as I indicated at the very beginning, the triple bar is used to translate this somewhat strange phrase, if and only if. And so the key here is that anytime you see if and only if, as you can see in the correct translation here, you simply replace that if and only if with a triple bar. You see it there. So what we're looking at here, it's a longer sentence, but what we're looking at is Tom is a bachelor, if and only if, what? Well, Tom is not married, unmarried, not married, and over 18. Okay? So the triple bar, you might realize or recognize that the triple bar looks a lot like an equal sign. And in fact, that's not an unfortunate coincidence. It's a good thing. Because what we're essentially saying is the statement on the left, in this case, Tom is a bachelor, means the same thing as the statement on the right, or is equivalent to. And the statement on the right in this case is that Tom is not married and Tom is over 18. So it's saying that one statement is equivalent to the one on the right and vice versa. It goes both ways, in other words. So just another quick example here, though. There's one other thing that the triple bar can be used to translate, and that would be the phrase sufficient and necessary condition. So if I told you that Tom's being a bachelor is a sufficient and necessary condition for taking this poll, right? Well, if a sentence is talking about something being both, not just necessary, not just sufficient, but both necessary and sufficient, then we can take that entire phrase, necessary and sufficient, and replace it with a triple bar. So we would say then, Tom is a bachelor, and that is a necessary and sufficient condition for taking this poll. Okay? And when you say something is a necessary and sufficient condition, again, you're saying that the one thing is equivalent to the other thing, that they're interchangeable, essentially. So the trick here is to, when you're reading a sentence and you need to translate it into the symbols of propositional logic, if you see the word sufficient or you see the word necessary, if they're by themselves, just sufficient or just necessary, use a horseshoe and translate it according to that sun formula we saw on the previous slide. However, if it's saying something is both necessary and sufficient, then you want to use the triple bar.